So welcome to this seminar. I'm very glad to have with us a guest from Austria, from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and our colleagues from the Università L'Orientale. I can't hide a certain emotion when we have guests from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, of this Institute for Cultural and Intellectual History of Asia, an institute that was founded in 1991. And it's a pleasure to have with us Birgit Kellner, which is director of this institute. An institute that I saw growing even when it was not an institute, it was just a commission in the 80s with Professor Oberhammer, who passed away recently. And in a certain sense, it's part even of my biography, so that that's the reason why I'm particularly interested in these topics. And today we start first with a contribution of Serena Saccone, which is a professor here at University of Napoli L'Orientale. She started her studies here in Naples and got a master's degree in philosophy and Indology from the University of Naples, and then a PhD of the University of Turin. But she also worked at the University of Palermo and at the Istituto Italiano per l'Africa e l'Oriente before starting to work at Vienna at the Austrian Academy of Sciences from 2015 to 2021 for a relatively long period. Her main area of interest is Buddhist logic. It's the Austrian school of Buddhist studies, and with a specific interest in epistemological themes and the internal debates between Buddhists regarding them. Already in her master thesis, she wrote on Buddhist philosophy, in this case on Kamalashila, and her PhD thesis. Not. Yeah.
Someone is saying that they can't.
That's true. So, welcome also our guests on internet. I just was introducing Professor Serena Saccone. She will speak on a topic that returns to one of the main research fields of the already quoted School of Vienna, on an author that was central even to Professor Ernst Steinkellner, Damakirti, and to Helmut Krasser, who had been directors of the institute before. And I just was presenting Serena Saccone and speaking about her PhD thesis, which was on a particular chapter of Shantarakshita's Tattva Sangraha and the related Panchika by Kamalashila. So today she turns, as I said, to a topic that is related to Damakirti, Esse, percipi, reality and knowledge in Indian Buddhism. Yours the floor.
I hope you can hear me. So, thanks everyone for being here and willing to hear my talk today. I am going to introduce of course the title is very ambitious, but I'm going to be less ambitious than that because I'm going to talk about a specific thing. And this specific thing, assuming this works, and it doesn't, wait a second. Okay, with this, okay, here you go. This specific thing is an example of a debate of externalism versus idealism, which we will see through a specific lens, a specific perspective, which is that of an argument related to the relationship between cognition and their objects. This argument is called in Sanskrit the Sahopalamba Niyama argument, which I have translated. You won't see any Sanskrit essentially because it's I want it to be accessible to all people who don't really know Sanskrit. So I'm translating every single thing. And I'm translating and talking about this argument as a necessary co-perception because Sahopalamba Niyama is where Niyama is the necessity, Upalamba is the perception, and Saha is along with, together, co in Latin and Italian also based language. So the necessary co-perception argument is an argument explicitly meant to establish the non-difference between an object and its cognition, based on a logical reason, on a reason which is the fact that one always invariably perceives them together. So they perceive always that object along with its cognition. Now, this is one of the most famous arguments in the tradition, starting from Dharmakirti, in what is called as the Dharmakirtian tradition, and also in other types of tradition, as an argument that proves the reality of what is called mere cognition in Sanskrit, Vijñāpti Matrata. I lied, there are Sanskrit words, so sorry. But I mean, you have always the translation, where the basic idea of mere cognition is that of this school, the Vijñānavada tradition of Buddhism, which is the idealistic part of our speech today, our talk today. So they are, let's say, idealists. And this tradition claims that the whole world, our experience, can be accounted with. The whole world consists of a flux of awarenesses which are unitary, identical to themselves, and they have no external, i.e. different objects, nor a subject perceiving them. So the whole experience, the whole world can be explained as this flux of instantaneous awarenesses which are identical to themselves, so partless, which are unitary and have no external objects, so they are not the perception of something else, and they are not perceiving by a permanent or non-permanent also subject whatsoever. So there is not a perceiving subject for these cognitions. So the aims of this talk is that I want to show that this argument should be interpreted mostly as proof of the fact that cognitions bear images of their objects. So my point will be that this argument is mostly oriented in discussing the nature of cognition, and then secondarily proving the fact that external objects don't exist. So I think that the main point of this argument is to prove what in Sanskrit is called the Sakaravada. So the theory that images, that cognitions bear images of their objects, okay? We will see that there is an opposing theory where actually cognitions do not bear images of their objects, and they are like light. So they limit themselves to illuminate an external shape, an external form of the object which is outside of them, okay? So, but this Sakaravada, this idea that cognitions bear images is in fact also a theme of another school, a school which is close to the Vijñānavada school, it's pretty close to the Vijñānavada school, but still it's an externalist tradition of Buddhism, meaning they do admit in a particular way that external objects exist and that cognitions are all external objects. The other thing that I want to talk about today is that this argument has a twofold interpretation, and this twofold interpretation, so proving the inexistence of external objects on one end and proving that cognition possesses images of their objects, this was already present, highlighted, and felt since the very inception of the use of this argument. And this is, I guess, the main point that I want to make, then that is felt as a major problem for its detractors, while, in my view, it's not so much felt as a problem for its proponents. And its detractors say, so what is the use of this argument to prove the inexistence of external objects if it holds true also for the upholders of the existence of material objects? I.e., if it holds true also for those who do admit images in cognitions, but also external objects. So the two things together. This being, again, the Sautranticas, which are externalists, where externalist finds a very close translation in Sanskrit, because Bahyartavadins means the upholders of the existence, in square brackets, of Bahya, external, Artha, objects. Okay. Now, where do we find this? We found this in the work by Dharmakirti, who is probably the most brilliant and definitely one of the most famous Indian philosophers. He's a Buddhist, of course. And he lived pretty much between they say 550, 650, 6th or 7th century. We find this in a verse of one of his most famous works. The name is Pramana Vinishchaya, which means the assertment of the means of cognition, of the means of the right means of cognition, etc. The Pramana Vinishchaya is, well, I dedicated myself to, with the help of a friend, to read the very first chapter, all of it in Sanskrit. And it is full with summary verses, which gives me even more the idea, which was already there, probably I'm not stating it for the first time, that this was some sort of a summa, some sort of like a summary of the views that Dharmakirti had expressed in a lengthier way, in more details, in a previous work of his, which is called the Pramanavartika. So in this Pramana Vinishchaya, he introduces this argument in this verse, and he says, a sense object, such as a blue thing, and its cognition are non-different because they are always necessarily, or invariably, some people translate, perceived together. This verse, along with some others from the same work, became very influential for the Dharmakirtian traditions, or for the tradition that follows, and as I said, also for traditions that were not Buddhist. And I find it very interesting that the Pramana Vinishchaya is, a lot of verses from the Pramana Vinishchaya are frequently quoted everywhere in the following Indian philosophical text, which might lend proof of the fact that this was a sort of a concise version of Dharmakirti's views. Now, the entire verse, as such, is introduced by Dharmakirti as related to the argumentation for the thesis of the reality of cognitions alone, Vijñapti Matratam. As you see here, there is this introduction. Okay, we say that there is a distinction between means of cognition, knowable, meaning an external object, an object, and a resulting cognition. We say that ordinarily, so we talk about this fact. So we ordinary people distinguish between an instrument, a means of cognition, and an object of cognition, and a resulting cognition, a cognition per se. But even though we do that, we can prove that there is only cognition in the sense that we were saying before. So a cognition which is unitary, a cognition that doesn't, there is this instantaneous epistemic event and it's partless, doesn't involve a means of cognition and an object of cognition and a resulting cognition. And how would we do that? If there is mere cognition, how can that be proven? So what is so we say stuff, we distinguish ordinarily, okay, we talk about this kind of a convention, but the reality is that of mere cognition. How do we prove that? And he says, well, we prove that due to the fact that the characteristics of apprehender and apprehended, so the fact that cognition is a subject or an object, there is a subject on an object when it comes to cognitions, is illogical. And just so you know, a little before then, he had made clear that there was this contraposition between what is ordinarily seen, which is a distinction between a means of cognition and resulting cognition and so forth, and what is real. And the reality is connected, as you see here, with the absence of external object. So when he's making this discussion, when he's introducing this topic, he's pretty clearly talking about, he's making a reference to the absence of external objects. He's talking about the fact that there are no external objects. So this is pretty clear. I mean, it's not so controversial. But when he says due when he says due to the logicality of the characteristics of apprehender and apprehended, meaning the fact that cognition lacks these two aspects, he's referring back to another verse, a previous verse, which is very much famous and also very much quoted in the following tradition regarding the statement of self-awareness of cognitions. So in this case, is connecting the existence of cognitions alone with the fact that cognitions are self-aware, meaning they don't need another subject to know them because they know themselves and they know only themselves. If you want Svasamvedana, sorry, because this is the Sanskrit self-awareness in the sense that it's the subject of this awareness is itself and the object of this awareness is itself. So you see, this is the Pramavamvinishaya point 38, where he said there is no other object different from itself that can be experienced by a cognition, and there is no experiencing of that cognition different from that cognition itself. So cognition is devoid of the aspect of the subject and object, of the apprehended and apprehender, and only manifests by itself, which is the nature, it's a statement of the nature of cognition. Cognition, they say, even this, Dharmakirti says this, and the old tradition repeats this metaphor, is like light. It's just manifesting, it's just appearing. Okay. Just to sum up, this necessary co-perception argument is presented as a demonstration of the true reality of cognition alone, in the sense of their being self-aware. So cognitions are self-aware as being devoid of an external object other than themselves. So they manifest knowing themselves, showing, and they will see they show themselves as endowed with an image. So this is what we are dealing with. Also, in the commentary to the other half verse, which I don't introduce because it would be, even though it's very important, it would be too much for this talk, he takes issue with the idea of the subjective aspect. So cognition is intrinsically aware of itself independently from another knower, and yet it is known. So, in other words, the necessary co-perception is a demonstration centered on the establishment of the nature of cognition, which is the only reality insofar as it is devoid of external objects and the subject perceiving them. Now, what is the argument that he does in the commentary to the verse, really? That we don't have a different form for an external object which is different from its experience. So we, at the same time, we see together the image of the object and we perceive its cognition. They're perceived exactly at the same time. So there is actually, what it actually says, there is not the apprehension of the image if you don't apprehend its cognition. So they are the object of the same exact direct perception. And insofar as they are the object of exactly the same direct perception, they are the same entity. They are the same thing. Because, as he says, it couldn't be possible that there is no apprehension of one thing unless there is the apprehension of the other, if they were two different things, if there was a difference in svabhava, in nature. So they are the same entity, they are the same thing. In fact, he says, take yellow and blue. Yellow and blue are two different things, and you have two different perceptions. You don't need to perceive the yellow to perceive the blue. You can perceive them separately. Actually, you do perceive them in different acts of perception. So they are different things, they are different entities. This is not the case with an image and its cognition, with a thing and its cognition. If you don't perceive the cognition, you don't perceive the thing. And so here you have words. When I know something like a blue thing, I know it always and only along with its cognition, which must be in turn apprehended. If I do not apprehend them together, both, I have no cognition of anything. So they're always necessarily found together. Okay, this we already said. So they are the object of the same direct perception, so they must be identical essentially, so the same thing. It's not like blue and yellow. Blue and yellow are two separate entities, and they are two objects of two separate perceptions. Even more interestingly, later, actually in the commentary to the second part of the verse, he says something which is, I think, even clearer, which is the existence of the existence of an object outside is really not so relevant in a way, because the perception of an object is due to the existence of its perception, not to the existence of the object. It is not the case that the perception of an object is due to the existence of the object, rather is due to the existence of its perception. So if we don't perceive the cognition of the object, we don't perceive the object. Okay. It's the condition sine qua non of its perceptibility, it's the apprehension of his cognition. Now, what does Dharmakirti do? And this is a very controversial part, and it's been the object of a lot of discussion or not a lot, but some discussion in various articles in secondary literature. Dharmakirti talks about the potential existence of an external object. And he says, even if there is an external object, there is a known difference between the object that appears in cognition and its cognition. So he's saying, well, okay, let's say that even if there is an external object, what we are really talking about here is the difference between an image and its cognition. So once again, I think he's making a point. We are talking about the nature of cognition. The nature of cognition is such that cognition possesses an image of their objects. And this is how cognition knows, knowing itself as endowed with the image of its object. So even if there is an external object, what we are saying here is that, well, there is no difference between an object that appears in cognition and its cognition. Okay. And in fact, like in the commentary, again, it says the non-difference between a blue thing that appears in cognition and its cognition is established. And it really looks like he's saying, well, it's not so let me say this straight. In this part, in this verse, and etc., initially it's sort of suggesting whether or not the object exists, external object exists. Anyway, nobody, we can agree, we can all agree that cognition has images, and knows the images and knows the objects through knowing itself as endowed with image of its object. We can all agree, as Vijñanavadins, as idealists, and you externalists, meaning though the specific type of externalists who admit the images in cognition, we sort of share this. And so, sort of like, okay, it doesn't matter if the external object exists. Is this the final point? No, it's not, because immediately after he says, wait a minute, but we don't need an external object. We don't need an external object to explain our experience, because we can explain it in other ways, which is, well, this would lead us too far, but with like latent impressions. So we don't need images that reactualizes themselves, let's say that. We don't need an external object, and briefly I must say that the truth is the one of the inexistence of external objects is the truth of the Vijñanavada. That's it. I am not Dharmakirti endorsing externalism, even though the point that we are making is acceptable for both parties. I mean, you, Sautrantika, can say as externalist that yes, cognition possesses images. This is fine. Okay. Yeah, okay, this is what he says after, which really, we will skip that, but it's mainly the second part of the verse is still going with the idea of the existence of an external object that can't be seen but could be inferred, but let's move forward. So the same theme is found in the Pramanavartika in at least actually more than one instance. I like to quote this instance because it's very literal. And as I said, this is also my impression that sometimes it sort of like summarizes verses from the Pramanavartika, or lengthier arguments from the Pramanavartika in sort of like a more concise way in the Pramana Vinishchaya. And the Pramanavartika uses pretty much the same word and the same ideas with regard to an object that is being brought to awareness necessarily, simultaneously, along with its cognition, by virtue of which other image is it's being different from that cognition proven. So, meaning I don't have another image in cognition that can prove the existence of an external object. Anytime I perceive an external object, I perceive it with an image in cognition. There is no way out of it. So there is no any potential other third image that could prove an external object without being in itself an image in cognition. It's like, as I like to say, Midas, the myth of Midas, King Midas. Everything I touch turns into cognition. Everything he touched turned into gold. Everything that I see turned into an image in cognition. So there is no way out of it. So there is no other image to establish the existence of an external object as being different from its image in cognition. So we only have one image, that of the object as being cognized, i.e. as being identical to its cognition. So this is pretty much the same thing. The main point would be here is that, like the verse that we have just seen, what his main point would be that we don't see in this particular occurrence, Dharmakirti is still upholding provisionally an externalist point of view, where like he is still saying that the object could be inferred. So he says that the object could be inferred, meaning like it can't be seen directly by direct perception, because direct perception only perceives an image in cognition, but could be inferred. And actually, what I find interesting is that there is this commentary by this author, Prajñākaragupta, who is part of the tradition, and he says, well, since they are not, so cognition and object are not gained differently, attained differently, the identity of the object with its cognition is difficult to avoid. Therefore, cognition is established as having images. Thus, then cognition only is directly seen, not the object. Why am I showing this? Because I find it interesting that in this Pramanavartika passage, the main point seems to be, once again, that we are proving that cognition is the nature, we're discussing the nature of cognition, and we're saying that cognition is established as endowed with images. So cognition knows its objects having through the images of these objects, whether or not the external object exists, okay? So here they're making a point more about the nature of cognition. Now, in some of the following literature, the necessary co-perception argument becomes standard proof for mere cognition, for this Vijñapti Matrata, in connection with the idea of self-awareness of cognitions, and this is really brought forward in terms of the idea of denying the existence of external objects, okay? In particular, in the tradition, it is connected with the refutation of the idea that direct perception can prove an external object. It can't. There is no what is called the proving means of cognition, a sadhaka pramana. We cannot prove an external object through direct perception. They think the important thing is that, at least to the best of my experience, when they use this argument, many times they use this argument, the necessary co-perception argument, when they are arguing about the reason why cognition, given its nature, cannot know an external object. And this argument is accompanied by a set of other arguments that address the existence, the logicality of the existence of the external object per se. So you have two types of set of arguments. One is, okay, the external object is absurd, and one of the most common idea that they bring forward is, for example, if you admit that external objects, so material objects consist of atoms, and atoms are indivisible, in spite of like our common Greek-based understanding of the term atoms, which is indivisible, they say very subtle, the subtlest thing, so that doesn't have parts, cannot be further divided. So they sort of share the same idea of like the atoms do not have parts, cannot be divided. And then they say, no, the atoms, if the atoms to be real needs to be indivisible, then it doesn't exist because it is divisible, because whenever it aggregates according to a difference of parts or a difference of directions in space, okay? So they have also this sort of arguments, set of arguments that try to prove the fact that, okay, external objects are illogical per se, and then there are a bunch of other arguments that deal more with the idea of the nature of cognition. And even if there is an external object, cognition doesn't have the capacity of knowing the external object. It can't, because it's devoid of these two characteristics of apprehending and apprehended and apprehended, and so forth. So this necessary co-perception argument is accompanied by, it's not the only proof, okay? This is the main point. But it is central. It is central so much that we have in the 8th century, which in India is a particularly fertile and interesting century, because we have all these schools and traditions of thought, not only Buddhists, also non-Buddhists, who somehow have at that point developed their doctrines in a very systematic way, in most of the times having developed due to a debate one against the other. And there is a specific figure, this author, Shubhagupta, who, unlike many of the Buddhists of his times, or like is a figure that stands out particularly because he is a Buddhist externalist. So he admits the existence of external object, and is very keen on refuting the idealism, the Vijñānavada. So he addresses a few of the works which are mostly important as they are sort of like the key text for proving Vijñāptimatrata, for proving mere cognition. And with this, he is particularly keen, he devotes a very long refutation to the Saopalamba-Niyama argument. So he does see Vijñānavada and Saopalamba-Niyama particularly connected, meaning like the Saopalamba-Niyama is very important for proving Vijñāptimatrata. And in fact, in the 8th century, we have these other two Buddhists, whom, as Wolfgang said, I studied, and those are, they are trying to prove idealism instead. And when they are trying to prove idealism, they actually defend the Saopalamba-Niyama argument, particularly against the refutations and the attacks of Shubhagupta. And as I said, again, they use it within the frame of the demonstration of the existence of cognitions alone, so Vijñāptimatrata. But as you are about to see, it is, of course, within the proof of the inexistence of external objects. It's one of the proof, yes. But what they say is, they make a special point, especially Kamalashila, in saying that the proof is intended against those who believe that sense cognitions do not have images of their objects. Well, as I said, the opposing tradition, which is, by the way, Shubhagupta's position, that the external form is outside and that cognitions limit themselves to illuminate those forms, okay? So, as we are about to see, they present the Saopalamba-Niyama argument as proof of the fact that cognition has the nature of possessing the images, and against the ones who support that they do not possess images of their objects. And in fact, here we have Shantarakshita. He points out that the identity is between the awareness of cognition of an object and the awareness of the image of an object. And again, also Kamalashila presents it as proof against the so-called Nirakaravadin, the one who does not admit images in cognition, the one who upholds the absence of images in cognition. And you see, they say the non-difference in order to prove the non-difference between the image of a blue thing and its cognition, Shantarakshita demonstrates this against the upholder of the thesis that a cognition is devoid of its image. Okay. Okay, this we can... Now, also another interesting point that he makes is, okay, we said it's against the one who don't admit that images in cognition, fine. Then he also says something to this effect. There is only one perception of the cognition recognized, so what is indeed the perception of a cognition is precisely also the perception of the cognized, and what is indeed the perception of a cognized is precisely also the perception of the cognition, okay? And then in passing, immediately after, he said, well, this statement is also acceptable for the externalist, for the Bayartavadin, for the Sautrantika, probably is meaning for the Sautrantika. Okay, so he's making, again, this theme comes back. Okay, this is acceptable also for the Sautrantika. This is not against the Sautrantikas. This is against the ones who do not admit images in cognition. Now, how much time do I have? Because, okay, now, let's go back to Shubhagupta, because Shubhagupta, just so you know, is earlier, a little earlier, or at least the works we are quoting, the work we are talking about is definitely earlier than the one by Shankarakshita and Kamalashila, because they actually mentioned, they mentioned him, especially Kamalashila. No, also Shankarakshita, sorry. They both mention his work. And Shubhagupta takes issue with the idea of the Saopalamba Niyama, and he takes issue with this idea, the necessary co-perception, and he does that in terms of the idea that this can be a valid refutation of the existence of external objects. He's pretty clear about this. He wants to demolish, to deny, to refute this argument because he wants to prove that external objects exist. And he phrases the argument as such. It has been taught, and this is my addition by Dharmakirti in the Paramarishchaya, that there is an invariable co-perception regarding something that is non-dual, and the intrinsic nature of cognition and cognized are indeed experienced together because there is a necessity of apprehending them together. So Shubhagupta is saying what we have said so far, no? What's the reason why we perceive them together? Because they are identical in nature. So cognition and cognized are identical in nature, so Dharmakirti says. And then he actually says, well, wait a moment, there is a reason which is connected with their nature. It is true that cognition and object have such a nature where you perceive them together, but it's not because they are identical. It's because cognition has exactly that nature of cognizing that object, and that object has exactly that nature of being cognized by that cognition. So what do we call conventionally that they are perceived together? First of all, is they are not perceived together. They're perceived very quickly one after the other. And they are perceived together because one has the nature of being the perceiver and the other has the nature of being the perceived exactly in this exact precisely causal or act of perception. Okay, so there is actually something related to nature, to essence, if you will, but this is not what you're saying. They're not identical in nature. In fact, the duality is necessary because there is no apprehender besides cognition, and there is no sense cognition without object. So you need two things to explain an act of perception. And he says the duality is necessary since there is no cognition that is left unknown, and there is no, there is no object, no cognition. There is no object that is left unknown, and there is no cognition without an object of it. So they are both apprehended separately as being two distinct entities, but they are apprehended separately, but together. We say that they are apprehended together because they are part of the same perceptual act, okay? They have the nature of being part of the same perceptual act. Now, Shubhagupta says many things about this, the problems with the necessary co-perception argument, many. And I must say, these problems had been addressed first and foremost by Kamalashila, and they are the object of many, once again, at least one scholarly contribution by a Japanese scholar. And I'm not interested in making those points. There are several points related to the use of the word co and so forth. I'm not interested in this. I'm interested in 3 points that he makes, which are less highlighted, less emphasized. Problem one is, what it says is like, and this is something that, by the way, you're about to see, Kamala Sheila also notices. This argument is a petitio principii. So he assumes what he wants, he presupposes what he aims to prove. Because for the Vijñānavadi, an external object is nothing but an image, for the idealist, an external object is nothing but an image of cognition. So in its true reality, there is no external object. The true reality of the external object is an image identical to cognition. So cognition experiences a part of itself. This is what you believe. So you want to prove, in the end, that cognition and object are identical because they are appended necessarily together insofar as they are identical. Because the one thing that you, Vijñānavadi, presuppose is that the act of perception is nothing but the cognition that perceives a part of itself. Because the external object is an image in cognition. So if you're saying they're always necessarily appended together, you're just assuming what you mean to prove. Problem two, well, first of all, okay, if the non-difference with the image is what is to be proven, then there is a petitio principii, okay, plus there is no dispute in this respect with the upholder of cognition as endowed with the image of its object. And for several reasons, I can tell you that when he's saying that, he's referring to the Sautranticas. So he says, like, okay, first of all, the petitio principii repeats it, okay, and also, well, you agree with the Sakaravadi in this, you agree with the Sautrantica in this, and my understanding would be then so much better, at least though they admit external objects, you don't. So much, there is a bit of a contradiction here because you want to prove the inexistence of external object and you're assuming and you're actually, and you are upholding a thesis which is completely fine for someone who admits external objects. Shubhagupta says that the necessary co-perception argument is good also for the Sautrantica. And a refutation of the external world does not necessarily follow because the same argument can apply to a thesis that still admits material objects through the image that they bestow on cognition. Problem three, the arguments do not refute the existence of external object. And what he says here is, well, the arguments in the Pramana Vinishchaya that you are talking about is you are talking about an identity at best between an image in cognition and its cognition. You're not talking about a difference with the object. The best you can prove with this necessary co-perception is the identity between a cognition and its image, but this image is not the same thing as the image of the external object. These are two different things. Even if you wanted to, anyhow, for example, let's say in the case of the idea of the Sautranticas who admit, these externalists who admit that we perceive external objects through their images, those are two different things. One thing is the image that we have in cognition, the other is the image outside, the image of the object. So this argument, Shubhagupta does say that, okay, this argument can be at most proof of the fact that the cognitions possess images of the objects, but it's definitely, you can't say that they can disprove external objects. Because the cognition is not of the external object. The cognition, the non-difference we are talking about is between the cognition and the image of the external object. In this particular case, so the main point will be, once again, we are discussing about proving something about the nature of cognition as being endowed with images, but definitely what you are aiming to do, which is denying the existence of an external object. No, you're not denying it. The most you can do is proving the reality of the identity between a cognition and its image, not the cognition and the image of the external object. That is out of the question. You don't know. You cannot prove that through this argument. Kamalashila actually, and I'm about to finish here, does refer to the petitio principii. He's actually mentioning one of the verses of Shubhagupta, literally, and he mentions that Shubhagupta has in mind that there can be a petitio principii. And the fact that he says is pretty interesting because once again, which is also the point that I want to make here, that they continue doing, I think both Kamalashila and Shubhagupta is, this argument really isn't about so much. It is and it is not about denying the existence of external object, but it is proof of the fact that images have the cognitions possess the image of their objects. And in fact, Kamalashila precisely says this, okay, what you say is fine, but this proof is against the upholder of the thesis that cognition is devoid of the image of its object. So, what you are saying misses the point because we are not here trying to prove the existence, we are not here, the petitio principii you're talking about, so the fact that you're saying, oh, well, if you want to prove that cognition is endowed with the image of the object, etc., then you're proving what you are assuming. And he says, no, we are not proving what we are assuming because what we want to prove is precisely the fact that cognition possesses images, because this proof is meant against the one who upholds the thesis that cognition is devoid of the image of its object. So, in other words, he's sort of implicitly conceding the point and say he could be considered a petitio principii, but it's not what it is meant to be. And what it is meant to be is exactly the proof of the fact that there is an identity between images and cognition, and so the cognitions knows images. This is what we want to do. So we are discussing the nature of cognition here. And this is not a petitio principii. We are proving a new point. We are proving that cognition is endowed with images because we are addressing the ones, in particular Shubhagupta, who deny that cognition possesses the images of their objects. So, is a proof of the non-difference between cognitions and images in cognition, not between cognitions and external objects. Conclusions. So the necessary co-perception argument is largely intended to demonstrate that cognitions are self-aware in terms of being devoid of external apprehended objects and an apprehender subject. It is widely used and defended in many following Buddhist logico-epistemological as well as non-Buddhist treatises for the purpose of proving mere cognition as being a standard proof, though mostly not sufficient by itself. This is the way it is intended in the 8th century by Shubhagupta, who sees it as one of the main arguments proving idealism, so the absence, the inexistence of external object. And Shantarakshita and Kamalashila defend this argument precisely against him. At the same time, the argument lends itself to be interpreted as proof of the identity between the knowable in the form of an image and its cognition. And this is in a way agreed by all parties to a different extent. In other words, it is agreed upon that it establishes the fact that cognitions possess images of their objects, and only consequently that there are no external objects. So I'm not denying that it is proof of there are no external objects, only that it's not the main point, and it's not seen as the main point of this proof. Given that, a question emerges. If the necessary co-perception argument can also prove the epistemic theory of the Sautranticas, and this seems to be something that to a certain extent the parties agree on, who admit external objects, even though as leaving their impression on cognitions, leaving their images on cognition. Is it really a good proof of the existence of mere cognition in the sense of the existence of external objects? And if not, why then did it become so popular? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize with our followers, with our fellows who are not specialized in Indian philosophy. This time our seminar is a little bit more specialized. Last year we gave a more introductory seminar on Indian philosophy, but you should not hesitate to make your questions, even simple questions. And to all our other colleagues, I invite you to fight with Serena. Okay, please come here in order that our colleagues in the internet can also hear you and follow you. Start. Yeah, please, here.
I'm sorry, I just have some clarificatory question, and I'm sorry because maybe it shows that I did not completely grasp everything, but it's just to understand better. Do you, in your talk, or Dharmakirti in the work that you analyzed, poses a clear difference between cognition, cognizing, and perception and perceiving? So these two things. And then I did not completely, I mean, I understand the general idea of critiquing both the existence of an external object, so of something that is apprehended, and on the same line also of what apprehends. But the point is then, how do we define cognition at that point? Because from an ordinary perspective, cognition is, I mean, implies a cognizer and a cognized. So my question is why using this terminology, and what defines cognition then, once apprehender and apprehended are lost? Okay. What defines the essence of cognition then? I don't know if it makes sense.
First of all, so your first question was?
The difference between cognition and perception.
Okay, the difference, okay. When I'm talking about this cognition, in particular, when it comes to this idea of external object, or the existence or non-existence of external object, I'm really talking about sense cognitions, which you could characterize as what you would call perception, sense perceptions, because the whole debate is essentially mostly centered on the idea whether or not sense cognitions have, as I said, there's this opposing ideas like sense cognitions, so perceptions. There would be also a long chapter to open in terms of like what direct perception is, and we actually did it a couple of years ago, what direct perception is in Buddhist terms, according to this school. But let's talk ordinarily, and we are talking about sense perceptions to meet, I mean, this type of shared ground. This sense cognition or sense perception, so you could call, can be explained essentially mostly in two ways, and these are the two ways I was trying to show today, even though I must say I must have I should have maybe make a little more of a point of saying that some of these traditions admit that, again, sense cognitions are explained through the fact that perception or recognition illuminates its object, and the form, the shape is external. So the nature of the thing is there, and the cognition limits itself to being the cognition of that form, which is in and of itself a nature, a form which is external. And there are those who admit that this type of cognition, these sense cognitions, do not, so the perception of sense dadas, does not occur in this way, but it's essentially, well, in Buddhism, I should say, there is this idea of instantaneity. So the fact that everything is essentially composed of instants that are continuously ceasing, that are continuously disappearing. So this form of cognition, of perception, would appear when these instants have left their image. In a second moment, one would be aware of the impression that this real thing has left, and cognition is aware of this second moment. So it's aware of the images in it. So this is why this is the thing. And the second thing would be?
It was about what qualifies cognition when both subject and object are lost somehow.
This is another main point. The cognition, as I tried to explain at the very beginning, is once again an instant, unitary, instantaneous reality, which in and of itself, even though we talk, and this is what I was trying to say, and that the Margherita says, even though we ordinarily, metaphorically, in the language, a common language, we talk of the fact that there is a means of cognition, and then there is an object of cognition, and there is a resulting cognition as a result of this act. The true reality, which they would call the ultimate reality, so not the reality of our conceptual interaction, is that there is this instant which is unitary and self-luminous and self-aware, and what you have is just this appearance, is just this they call it a dharma, this instant of reality that has this nature, the nature of being self-aware, and in being self-aware of its appearance with an image, which is the image of the object. So really, when the question that you are asking is posed from the perspective of the ordinary discussion, but the reality is we can talk about a means of cognition, a recognized object, but the reality is this unique event, which is a cognition, self-luminous, self-aware.
Okay, thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Serena, for the presentation. I wanted to ask just a curiosity or clarification of what you said, because if I understand well, the point, one of the points is that the co-perception principle proves the Sakkara, the having an image in cognition, and the Svasamvedana, being self-aware of cognition. But this argument can, by itself, also refuting the Sautrantika argument. And in this sense, I was wondering what is the main argument against the Sautrantika view? if the whole Pranayama does not disprove this authentic argument in itself.
So, for example, I can tell you that there is this idea of the fact that for example, in the Bhagirartha Pariksha, they say, first of all, they say, okay, they try to say that a cognition is incapable of perceiving an external object without the image, and then they say also with an image of the object. And what they say is that because in that case you would lose either they use the so-called neither one nor many argument. They say, okay, there is no possibility of the coexistence, identity of cognition and images, because the images are many and the cognition is one. So you either lose the fact that cognition is supposed to be unitary, or you lose the fact that you see many images. So for example, in this, there is a lot this type of argument, then that's not possible. There is no possibility for, it's illogical as well. Based on this neither one nor many argument, you have to be one, you admit that there is one unitary cognition, but this one unitary cognition is endowed with many images, so you lose the unity of the cognition, and so they can't be identical.
It's a good argument. Because I thought also about
so
another argument.
You're looking for the unitary. Then they say, yeah. So what can be the unitary? You really are looking for that unitary cognition in the chitra, in the varied images, and so they go on forward saying like, oh, maybe it could be the image of the atoms. And they're sort of like, so you have these images of atoms that compose and create this image, but you still maintain a unitary image, and the unitary image will be of the atom, and they say, no, there is no such a thing. There is no the unitary image of the atom. You don't have an image of the atom, and also they can't compose for the usual...
Yes, because at that point, the other question is how can we prove the variety inside the cognition if the cause is not external?
Mm-hmm.
So everything goes with the idea of Jnaptimatra, and that variety is caused by the samskaras, I think.
But I actually have a question for you, because so in Abhinavagupta, this is brought forward as straightforwardly as proof of the inexistence of external objects, right?
Yes, it is. First, he uphold he defends the Sautrantic argument, just to explain how the idealist explanation for the variety of cognition does not hold according to him, because we can't rely on just of the samskaras, which determine just the content of a cognition, but does not explain the relation between cognitions themselves. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I have one more general remark, which occurred to me precisely as you were now referring to the Chitta discussion. I think this could be construed as a point against the assessment of the Pramana Vinishchaya serving as a summa of the Pramana Vartika, because this is precisely an argument which occurs only in the Pramana Vartika and makes no appearance at all in the Pramana Vinishchaya.
That's true. Yeah.
What occurred to me while you were discussing the necessary co-perception inference was, I mean, I've always read it a little bit different in its relationship to Svasamvedana as the idea that a awareness event And there are some who argue that awareness is a better translation of jnana as cognition, because cognition is, in contemporary philosophy, at least in analytic philosophy, associated with higher cognitive acts, theoretical modes, what in Buddhist context would be conceptualization, and that is not a good idea for translating jnana, especially in a Buddhist context. In any case, so the idea, if we take Svasamvedana to be the idea that an awareness has to be innately aware of itself, yeah, qua awareness event, not necessarily of its intentional content, but qua its awareness event. Now, this seems to me a claim that does not follow from the Sahupalamba Niyama inference. Because the Sahupalamba Niyama inference, a part of it is that when the object is perceived, the perception is also perceived. And when the perception is perceived, the other way around, when the perception is perceived or is brought to awareness, then the object as well. But the fact that the awareness is directly self-aware, and not made conscious by a second order cognition. I don't think this is proven by the Sahupalamba Niyama event itself. Yeah? So the idea that a perception has to be aware of itself is not actually proven, and you can see that, I think, in the Pramana Vinishchaya passage, because Dharmakirti goes into one of the most common arguments globally, philosophically speaking, for establishing this kind of claim, and that's an infinite regress. Yeah? It's not a direct argument for Svasamvedana, but just arguing that if you assume the other thing, namely if you assume a higher order theory of cognition, like Kumarila, for instance, does, then you have the infinite regress problem. But the very claim that cognition has to be brought to consciousness to begin with remains, I think, a major lacuna in Dharmakirti. I don't think he explicitly justifies this step. And this is what Kumarila, for instance, and others disagree with. You can have unconscious cognitions, no problem.
Okay, so I have 3 points to make. One is the idea of cognition and awareness. Yes, I do translate it as awareness, but I thought I was going to be more clear in this context to use the word cognition as opposed to awareness, even though like I've used awareness. I think it slipped also sometimes my attention. I used awareness for self-awareness. I do translate it like that. But today I wanted to be more clear, saying self-cognition, so to be a little more, or yata darshanam, if you will, or sort of like an ordinary way of speaking. The fact of it's interesting because we were seeing that with Luigi, we were translating this, the second part of the verse 154 CD, there is a reference to the regressus ad infinitum, and it's very cumbersome. I mean, maybe we are not smart enough to understand it fully, but we both thought that like it was a succinct way of describing it, which it was much clearer, for example, in Kamalashila or in Dharmakirti, in other works of Dharmakirti. So that was one of the things that, like, I'm mentioning this because this was one of the things that made us think, well, this seems to be something that you need to know something from a previous work, or you need to really have a previous knowledge, because it's not very clear it wasn't very clear according to us. So it really looked like some short version of it. And this is true also, for example, when you talk about Chintamai Prajñā at the end, this is said shortly. So we sort of like were making a point, but maybe like it really is referring to something, really this is maybe not a summa, but something that somehow presupposes a previous knowledge that maybe people were getting from the Pramana Vartika as opposed to the Pramana Vinishchaya. This was the, and then what was the other thing? And then third, I agree with you, and you have a very good point, but when I say that, well, my talking about Saopalambanyam as connected to Svasamvedana, so self-awareness, was mostly trying, as usually I do, showing a little bit of maybe some of the textual evidence, the fact that he was referring to a verse which is otherwise, so the 138, which is otherwise very well connected with the idea of self-awareness of cognition. So this is why I probably said more literally, Dharmakirti connects it to that statement of self-awareness. Whatever that statement then philosophically can be interpreted.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say about the notion of cognition and clarity.
Okay.
My experience in talking to philosophers, and there are many different philosophers, experts in Western philosophy and so on, when Indologists speak of cognition, nobody understands what we mean. It really, I think it really seems to be a problem in our terminology.
Okay. I think it's time for probably, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's start again. I'd like to present Patrick McAllister, who received a master degree in philosophy from the University of Vienna in 2005, and then a PhD University of Vienna at the Institute of South Asian, Tibetan and Buddhist Studies, and it was a PhD supervised by Helmut Kratzer, and his primary research interest is the development of Buddhist epistemological theories, the centuries from the 9th to the 11th century, and especially in the works of Prajñākaragupta, Chenana Srimitra and Ratnakirti. Patrick is also much engaged in projects of digital humanities. He significantly contributes to the conceptual, methodological and technical development of two particular resources called, with abbreviation, EAST, a tool to collect bibliographical and prosopographical information on the South Asian and Tibetan philosophical literature dealing with logic and argumentation, and another tool called SARET, a growing and dynamically developing library of Indic texts, especially in Sanskrit. And then I'd like to mention at least one important publication of Patrick, Ratnakirti's Proof of Exclusion of 2020, and one of the edited books, Reverberations of Dharmakirti's Philosophy, the Proceedings of the 5th International Dharmakirti Conference, was edited by him and other persons, among those Birgit Kellner. And an older publication from 2015, in which is mentioned also Helmut Kratzer, even if this was already after his death, and this was the publication Cultural Flows Across the Western Himalaya. Here's the floor.
Thank you very much for this coming. So I'm supposed to go on for 45 minutes?
I should at least mention the topic of the it's all Inference, traces of Dignāga in Prajñākaragupta's thought. Please.
Okay, I'll just switch on the timer here. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and especially for the kind invitation to speak here and present to a great crowd, actually. Very thrilled that there are many philosophy people here. I'm going to jump right in, actually, since it's getting late. And so I'd like to proceed in 3 steps in this talk, more or less. I'll first introduce Prajñākaragupta, a person, and the tradition that he finds himself in, this Pramana tradition. Then I'll try to say a few words about one thing that I think is central to Prajñākaragupta's theory. That's the sort of interdependence of inference and perception in order to facilitate, let's say, rational activity, finding your way around in the world. And then I'd like to posit that I'll explore this avenue, that Prajñākaragupta, in formulating this part, this holism, as I call it in the second section, relies heavily on Dignāga, or was at least inspired by something that we find in Dignāga's language theory. So let's see how far I get resolve this. So let me introduce Prajñākaragupta. So he was active sometime between 750 and 900 of the Common Era in India. Currently, we're a bit hesitant to narrow it down further. We have a postquem and antequem date, but we can't really say much, as is unfortunately often the case for authors in South Asia, pre-modern authors. According to Tibetan accounts, he was a layman, which in this tradition that he is in is quite the exception. Usually one would expect monks, scholar monks, to work on these kinds of topics. He wrote the Pramanavartika Alamkara, or Pramanavartika Alamkara Bhashya, that Serena also mentioned in her talk, which is often considered as a very unconventional commentary on Dhammakirti's Pramanavartika. Dhammakirti should be put in the 6th to 7th century, and which itself, so Dhammakirti's Pramanavartika itself calls itself, or identifies as a topical commentary, as Birgit, I think, likes to call it, on Dignāga's Pramana Samuccaya. Dignāga was active in the 5th century. So you see that Prajñākaragupta comes after several hundred years of a development of this school or tradition. It's also, to a large extent, a commentarial tradition, so a significant amount of texts that actually are the basis for identifying this tradition, so are commentaries on other texts. So you saw a few examples of those in Serena's talk already, and I'll be talking about Prajñākaragupta's one. In terms of influence on later thinkers, he was quite influential on scholars in Vikramashila, Jnana Mitra especially, but also Ratnakirti, which is how I arrived at my interest in Prajñākaragupta. They were active in the 11th century, early 11th century, and in particular, he was influential for them for the Chitra Advaita Vada, sorry for the Sanskrit term, but that's something that Serena also just mentioned. And then after him it becomes a theory that mainly tries to explain how an awareness can be unitary but have a manifold, a variegated object. So how can we, like visually we have many different colors, patches, objects, how is it possible that it's just one awareness? And if at the same time as Jnana Mitra, Prajñākaragupta and many others in the tradition were, you are a very radical sort of idealist, so you can't use external factors, objects to explain these differences, you're supposedly trying to put two contradictory, or opposite at least, properties into one thing, i.e. into awareness, namely that it is manifold and that it is non-dual. But that's the topic for another talk. He also got some opponents to be angry with him, in particular Basavajñā, who was active in the early 10th century, sorry. And he wrote a detailed Nyaya, this is a different non-Buddhist school in India, refutation of many points of Prajñākaragupta's work in the Nyaya Bhushana. And Basavajñā, interestingly, much like Prajñākaragupta, is also considered a bit of an individualist, let's say, in his interpretations. So he goes against some quite established Nyaya theories. But anyway, that's more or less it for the historical background. I'm glad to try and answer questions. For my presentation here, actually, so in terms of content, I would like to start off by adjusting our perspective a bit when we read Pramana texts, this tradition, text from this tradition. It's useful to start from some basis, and I'd like to take the opportunity a few minutes to sketch this, taking my cue basically from this justified true belief analysis of knowledge. I don't think anyone really takes that seriously anymore, at least as a full definition of knowledge, but still perhaps quite a few people, philosophers, would agree that it at least names some of the elements that are central to whatever knowledge really is. In other words, this justified true belief analysis does pick out some key characteristics of knowledge. I think it's useful, as I say, to use this analysis to highlight some specific differences to the Indian, and in particular to the Buddhist model of knowledge that authors like Prajñākaragupta and many of the authors that Serena talked about organized their arguments around. So let's try and do this. I'd like to think or suggest that we think of Buddhist philosophers in this tradition as something I'd call epistemic pessimists. What I mean by that label is that they, by and large, think that an awareness of reality as it really is the rare exception. In the final analysis, so if you manage to read lots of their texts, such as a large amount, then you'll see that they concede that only an enlightened being, a Buddha, can be said to know reality as it really is. But the knowledge that such a being experiences is, more or less by definition, beyond the everyday kinds of awareness episodes that we are familiar with when we talk to each other, when we plan a trip, or even try to write a philosophy paper. We deal in concepts, in conceptual awareness events, whereas proper knowledge properly speaking, in this tradition is direct and not conceptual. So, we must concede that if belief, arguably the core element in this JTB analysis of knowledge, involves concepts, and it's hard to see how it wouldn't, then it would categorically miss what Buddhists of this tradition hold to be the only true knowledge, a perceptual, direct, and therefore non-conceptual realization of reality. So we have to change the connotations of belief, its relation to propositions and so on, quite drastically in order to accommodate knowledge in this tradition. By the way, this is where these Buddhist thinkers also locate the fundamentals of Buddhism as a spiritual endeavor or as path to liberation, because one might be conceptually aware that there is no self and that things are impermanent, two facts that make it impossible to be free from suffering on a permanent basis. But knowing this in the conceptual, everyday sense and of having a justified true belief of it is certainly not what constitutes liberation from the cycle of rebirth. To achieve such a liberation, one has to be directly aware of these facts in each and every individual experience that one has. To arrive at that state of mind requires a structured, specialized, and disciplined sequence of practical activities, a stark regimen essentially of repeated mental cultivation. And this sort of thing over time produces actual liberation, the sort of insight that is required in order to free oneself from samsara. To be an epistemic pessimist thus means that we are fundamentally in error about the world around us. We are mistaken not only when we suffer the consequences of horrible mistakes, like when we wear a Juve t-shirt to explore the center of Naples, but even when we gain some scientific insight with mathematical precision. Most importantly, for thinkers like Prajñākaragupta, we are mistaken when we act as if there are objects which are external to our mind and which persist throughout time. These two verses here by Prajñākaragupta, they state more or less the fundamental elements. We're going to see them again a bit later. the fundamental elements of this epistemic pessimism quite concisely, and they also introduce perception and inference here. Perception, a type of direct and non-conceptual form of awareness that shows its objects exactly as they are, does not establish what Prajñākaragupta calls difference, in Sanskrit that's Beda, and objects. So the artha, Bāhya artha mostly in this case, but any kind of object actually. So he's referring here to, with objects, to mind external entities that persist throughout time, a certain span of time, so like this table has a certain duration, 100 years probably or something. And these are often also material things, these objects. With difference, he's referring to any sort of difference in general. That's a bit hard to grasp as a concept, but important cases of such differences include that between subject and object, between substances also and properties, and even that between individual objects, so how one chair is different from another chair, as well as classes of objects. As an extreme idealist, Prajñākaragupta does not believe that there is anything that isn't the present awareness. And this includes other mans and even temporal phases of a single man continuum, the different mental, non-present phases of a mental continuum. For our purposes today and here, it's important to understand that perception is not the foundation for any of the factors of everyday experiences, tables, chairs, doors, anything. Perception does not establish such objects. Yet our daily activities posit or presuppose that they exist as something material, right? You think you can interact with this table. It's something external to a man, so I'm not identical, and this is a material object, whereas my awareness is a different kind of thing. And I must assume that this table will be here tomorrow. Or at least you must assume it, otherwise you'll have to reorganize things drastically. To put it more bluntly, so perception doesn't give us this information for Prajñākaragupta. In the end, it's inference which gives us this information. And to put it very bluntly and to make a point of this, before I come to the next section here, Buddhist authors we are concerned with today, especially Prajñākaragupta, propose a theory of mitigated error rather than a full theory of knowledge. Most aspects of our everyday conceptual awareness episodes are epistemologically better analyzed as errors of varying degrees rather than as cases of knowledge in any sort of JTB sense. So I hope that sort of provides enough of a context for the next bit. The main element that I want to focus on for Prajñākaragupta here is that the two sources of knowledge, as he and his tradition calls them, and from which the tradition actually takes its name, pramana, for a source of knowledge, are perception and inference. I'll stick with this here first, sorry. And Prajñākaragupta's claim, and this is quite unique in the tradition as far as I can see, is that they depend on each other. And in which way exactly they depend on each other, that's what I'm going to try and figure out here. So they mutually depend on each other. You can't have perception without inference, and you can't have inference without perception. This is what I would like to call Prajñākaragupta's holism about inference and perception. These two sources of knowledge. Prajñākaragupta advocates this holism, I would say, quite strongly within the sphere of everyday activity. So again, we're limited to our everyday endeavors, trying to interact with external objects, with other people, all these sorts of things. So in the radical idealist perspective, of course, all of this breaks down, more or less, or is not there or not relevant. When I say that he endorses this sort of holism about inference and perception, what I mean is that he maintains you cannot have or explain one without the other. Prajñākaragupta thinks it's impossible to give a coherent account of only perception or only inference as sources of knowledge if you accept the Buddhist definition, and that's important, of a source of knowledge as leading to successful activity, right? So just to backtrack for a second, the upshot of this was that the source of knowledge bestows upon you, gives you an awareness episode, puts you into an awareness state in which you can act reliably. Taking this option helps Prajñākaragupta and many others in the tradition to avoid the problem that belief is usually somehow associated with conceptual construction or propositions or anything like that. So you know how to walk past an object without specifically inferring or being conceptually aware of that. Right? And accordingly, there are several fundamental layers to this. A person has to be convinced that external or that objects are mind-independent and different from the person who's acting. So they're not actually of the same nature of awareness. A person acting in the world cannot be an idealist, and such a person must assume that things endure throughout time for a while. The idea that perception and inference depend on each other is meant to analyze just this sort of everyday activity. And Prajñākaragupta repeats this idea in several sections of his very voluminous work. So I'll be looking at a few of those passages now in this part of the presentation. In the couple of verses here, I apologize for this one, I didn't translate literally, but the summary below is quite close to the tries to pick up all the points from the Sanskrit above. Prajñākaragupta makes the point that perception needs inference at first, as he says, aditah in Sanskrit, so in the beginning. That's the word at the end of the first line of Sanskrit there. And that's rather important. Again, remember that I was trying to say that an awareness causes activity is pravartakam. That's the second word from the end there in the first line. Causes activity means that it is a source of knowledge because the kind of activity it causes is reliable, or it causes it in a reliable way. This is the criterion for what it means to be a source of knowledge. In this context, and in order to be a source of knowledge, this awareness needs to cause activity that is reliable, that allows you to obtain your goal in a fashion that is dependable. It provides certainty that activity will be successful. Prajñākaragupta goes on in the second line to say that, likewise, inference needs perception. The qualifier at first, from the first verse, does not carry over into the second verse. As I said, Prajñākaragupta uses this notion. He uses this notion here repeatedly throughout his third chapter, the Pratyaksha chapter. And that explains so it has been explained, the iti pratipaditam, which is more of a Sanskrit problem. Yeah. Prajñākaragupta follows up this general statement by saying that it's not usually assumed to be the case that inference precedes perception, or that we have inference first and then a perception. And I think what he's implying here with this ishyate, this assumption, by saying that it is an assumption, is that it is actually the case. We posit some sort of temporal sequence between inference and perception, and everyone is quite happy with that. So to explain, usually you say you perceive smoke, and then following that perception or observation, you infer fire. There is a fire there. That's the usual sequence. And Prajñākaragupta wants us to understand that actually it's also the other way around. We basically infer fire, and then he explains that the obtainment, when we go to the fire, obtain it, our perceptual awareness there, when we reach the fire and have direct experience of it, this makes the inference, fulfills sort of the function of the inference, let's put it like that. We will need to dig a bit deeper to fully appreciate these points. The first thing to consider is that inference is actually the primary element in everyday activity. You remember that I pointed out that he says, thus it has been explained, and I think he's pointing to a verse quite at the beginning of the same chapter, so 200 verses ago here. That's, I put the verse here, that below is a literal translation I tried to give. So the proponent says it was stated here that without something called habituation, perception is not a means of valid cognition. Therefore, only inference is the main element in this case. That has to be understood or should be understood. The set of verses that this verse belongs to, together with the surrounding prose explanation, is where Prajñākaragupta tells us that inference is the more important element, the primary element for everyday activity. You won't be able to start acting towards things, towards external objects, unless you use inference. This seems to be the idea at this point. This is a bit controversial, let's say, because I don't think anyone really in this tradition came up with this theory directly. Usually what is assumed is that there are small awareness episodes which don't qualify as cases of knowledge or as knowledge episodes, like recognition or identification, saying that this is the table that I saw yesterday, or the chair and that chair, they have the same color. These would not be classified as inferences typically in this tradition. However, if you study this beginning passage, I think it's quite clear that Prajñākaragupta does classify them as inferences. And if you like Abhinavagupta, you'll be, so pratyabhijñā is explicitly mentioned there, so recognition or something like that, as a sort of inference. So these are very basic things, something that modern discourse is sometimes referred to as not a belief, but an elif. So this very protean, deep down, conceptually structured quasi-perception. And I think that's what Prajñākaragupta is really thinking about. A commentator from the 11th century, Yamari, he adds an interesting example in the context of these verses. He says that when a child starts to recognize its mother, so a very young child, this sort of related to object permanence and things like that, this very early pre-linguistic psychological developments, that's an inference. That's an inferential awareness, that what happens there. But I'll try to show you an example afterwards, later on, if I have time, of a very base level inference in the tradition, a very prominent one. And I think part of my talk is going to be that, well, maybe the main point, according to the title, would be that actually I think that this prominent old example is where Prajñākaragupta sort of gets this idea, even though I can already say that I don't have super firm proof for that. Anyway, let's continue here with this interdependency of the awareness events. So, one branch of this dependency relation is that perception needs inference. Prajñākaragupta tells us, without inference, perception is a means of valid cognition with regard to its awareness of itself. So, Serena mentioned this Svasamvedana, and that's basically what this will be about. So, perception in and of itself doesn't provide an adequate foundation for everyday activity. It is a means of valid cognition or a source of knowledge. These are two ways of translating the same Sanskrit term, which are not fully interchangeable, it seems to me, but they manage to pick out different aspects of the same concept that these philosophers have. So for our purposes, probably I should have said perception is a source of knowledge with regard to its awareness of itself. But that's useless, essentially, for everyday activity. So you don't self-awareness doesn't provide any way to interact with mind external objects. And that's exactly what he says here. These are the verses that we saw shortly before. In a perception that is merely an awareness of itself, no external object is established, nor any difference of such objects. Hence, nothing at all would exist, only non-duality would remain. So this, as an idealist, he actually would endorse this, but since he's here arguing in the context of activity that is directed at external objects, this is just not sufficient. And he explains quite clearly that perception does not establish an object or a difference without inference. Thus, perception is not a source of knowledge without such an inference. We still have to remember this aditahach at first. The important thing is that initially, when you first see an object, let's say, you don't have it's not automatized yet. So perception can't really help you to start any activity. That's why you need inference at first. Inference also depends on perception. There are two ways actually in which this happens. So first of all, you have to perceive some logical mark. So the standard example would be I infer fire from smoke, and I must at some point have perceived the smoke to understand that it's there, and then use it in an inference. The opponent, however, doesn't like, and then there's the second branch, where inference depends on a subsequent perception. So Prajñākaragupta, this holism is a very strong one, in that both inference and perception have to be both preceded and succeeded by the other. But I don't need to explore all branches of this dependency. I'm just trying to focus on some which will be useful for seeing the main point then in a minute. The opponent asks, well, okay, inference, once we've inferred something, like the presence of fire over there, that's a source of knowledge without a following perception, right? But Prajñākaragupta is quite adamant, and he says, no, inference only indicates a fire whose place has not been revealed. So you don't actually know where the fire is exactly, and you need to walk up to it and perceive it in order to, clearly understand where it's placed and sort of have this, be able to interact with it as a particular thing that is capable of fulfilling your aims, basically. He has this example of inference showing you fire that's behind a wall or something like that, behind a wall, and you have to actually walk around and have a look at it. Inference only gives you this awareness in a general sense. Okay, so that's more or less what I wanted to say about the relationship between inference and perception. I hope it became clear that for Prajñākaragupta, you need perception to anchor your inference basically in a particular place or location, bind it, tie it to one particular object, to one real thing. But perception, especially, mainly because it is non-conceptual, cannot, at first at least, without conceptual awareness, generate activity. And in order to do this, so in order to allow us to act, we need this thing called abhyasa, which is habituation. Actually, so that's sometimes get worried about the translation. It's literally, it's probably repeated activity, but of course you don't like, it's not like something just happens all the time, but it's actually this process by which you get used to something, so you get into a habit. really speaking. And then abhyasa can also refer to this result of this habitualizing process, more or less. And that's crucial for Prajñākaragupta's account. So he really thinks that perception can only count as a pramana, only count as a source of knowledge in the sense that it lets you act once this abhyasa is in place. So what you'd assume at this point is that this habituation is somehow started, prompted, initiated through inference. And I think you'd be right to say that. I've tried to publish, so in some publications I've tried to prove this. One of the main questions that I was not able to solve yet is whether this is really an outlier, really a very peculiar idea to Prajñākaragupta, because as I mentioned, much of the tradition says that you have perception, it's followed by conceptual awareness, like smoke, then you think, there is smoke there, and then from this you conclude that there is fire there. So you have this intervening conceptual awareness. Anyway, I'll be happy to answer questions about this. I think I can skip it more or less for this talk here. So, where do I see that Prajñākaragupta might be taking this from? I think we can find this in Dignāga's model. So you remember at the beginning, I said that Prajñākaragupta is writing a commentary on a text by Dharmakirti, which itself is a sort of commentary, very loose commentary, let's say, on a text by someone called Dignāga. And Dignāga is considered the founder of this tradition, properly speaking. Dharmakirti is usually said to have eclipsed, in a sense, Dignāga. His texts are much more important, let's say, for everything happening after him, so after the 6th or 7th century. So historically, that's certainly true. However, I think for part of Prajñākaragupta's project in writing a commentary on Dharmakirti's text is to reinstate or revive, perhaps, some of the elements of Dignāga's philosophy. I've got a few, not many, 2 or 3, and I thought I would be able to talk about all of them here. That's why I called this traces of Dignāga's philosophy, but I'll actually only be talking about one, and it's this one here. We start with a non-Buddhist, Bhatrihari, a famous philosopher from the grammatical tradition, I think one would have to say, even though really grammar doesn't do justice to his word idealism that's formulated not so long probably before Dignāga's time, so not more than maybe 1 century or so. And we find this system of thought based on language analysis largely present in Bhatrihari's work. And here I follow the translation by the German scholar Rau, and I would translate this verse here. Others, so someone else, teaches that it's due to repetition, again this abhyasa, due to habituation. Every word is a cause for a flash of insight, what in Sanskrit is called a pratibha, in order to generate the correct understanding of an object, or the object of a word, in children and animals. A Japanese colleague of ours, Professor Ogawa, supports this interpretation in general, so that's fine. He has some interesting reflections on the notion of pratibha, but luckily I can sidestep this in this presentation. And I don't need to explain what this flash of insight is. It's basically, we can think of it for the purposes of this talk as just what you understand once you hear a word that you know. And now I have to say a few things about word. In Bhatrihari's, and then probably also in much of the Buddhist tradition, Shabda should, which I've been translating, paraphrasing as word, should properly be speech, sound, so spoken utterance. And it's really sort of the smallest possible meaningful unit of speech. So it's a bit more than just any sound. It's intentional, it carries meaning, and the Shabda par excellence is actually the sentence. So for Bhartrihari and also for Dignāga, it seems, you don't really have any meaning on the subsentential level. So you need a whole statement, even if it's just one word with an implied verb, basically, to generate this flash of insight. In any case, already for Bhartrihari, this is due to some sort of repetition or habituation. The Aparai, the others that say this, are not necessarily opponents of Bhartrihari. His commentator, Punyaraja, says these are the Acharyas, so a certain group of scholars who precede him, and I'm not enough of a Bhartrihari expert to actually say who he's talking about here, but it would indicate, I think it's possible to read this as just some others say and it's not all wrong, something like that. I just wanted to introduce the notion here. Now, turning to Dignāga, the founder, in a way, or whose texts constitute the beginning of this Pramana tradition, starts the 5th chapter of the Pramana Samuccaya with this statement. So he tells us that an awareness arising from a word is not a source of knowledge other than inference. So what happens when you hear a word and understand it, is implied, is actually a sort of inferential event. And then he explains that, or gives a reason for it. Such a word, like any other reason property, such as being produced, or the presence of smoke, for example, indicates its proper object, so the object that you can infer on its basis, by excluding other objects. This exclusion of other objects is Dignāga's way of talking about universals, about general characteristics, as it were. Already for Dignāga, it's true that conceptual awarenesses don't give us access to any real entities, but they operate by excluding other things. And so you get the notion of commonness or universal is basically introduced by a sort of exclusion of other things. So this is the Apoha theory of the double negation, which is a form of double negation. And this is really an extensive and important topic for Dignāga in this 5th chapter of that work, because, for example, then 33 verses later, in verse 34, he concludes that in the case of a word, denoting the proper object is an inference that excludes other objects. So it's a slightly different formulation of the initial claim. So, in my opinion, it's very clear for Dignāga that verbal awareness is an inference. The word is the reason property, just like smoke can be a reason property for inferring fire. And the object of sentences is then not fundamentally different from the object of a word. That's the link to Bhartrihari. In verse 47 of the same chapter, Dignāga, if we read this verse together with the commentator, Jinendra Buddhi, is saying that no real thing is the object of a sentence, or any sort of speech, any sort of spoken utterance, let's say, because even in the absence of such an object, even when such an object doesn't exist, so if you can't see what the person is talking about, for example, then just in accordance to the hearer's different respective habituations, sentences generate different awarenesses in different hearers, according to each person's own causal conditions. So what that means, there's a nice example. Somebody says tiger in an alarmed voice, and then there's a hunter in the crowd who gets out his bow and arrow and is very excited that he's going to have a chance to fight. And then the ladies at court have a slightly different reaction, which is quite the opposite. There are many cases actually where abhyasa, this sort of repetition, is used to explain the differentiation of conceptual responses to sense stimuli. So a classic example that Birgit has also worked on, for example, is that there is the corpse, or at least the body of a woman, and a dog, a lecherous man, and a monk, basically, who has cultivated his mind, see this, and they each have very different reactions, and that's also due to abhyasa. But what I want to point out specifically here is that the presentation of abhyasa, of this repetition, is here in the context of the arising of verbal awareness, which, for Dignāga, as I tried to say, is a sort of inference. So this is a specific way that abhyasa, or repetition, is invoked or works within an inferential, in the build-up to an inferential awareness, how it produces that. We see smoke, we hear the word tiger, and then we act in a certain way. And there's no conceptual experience involved anymore. You immediately get frightened if somebody says tiger, just like you might if you understand and have sort of naturalized or habitualized yourself to smoke, meaning fire. Then you don't have to think, wait a moment, smoke is usually the result of fire, and that means if I can see smoke there, there's actually a fire over there. You don't do that, you just I don't know, get the fire extinguisher and go for it, hopefully. To add one more, if I have to have a few more minutes, case, which is related to this, because Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, who Serena, they were prominent in Serena's presentation, latch on to this, and they have a nice 2 verses, basically, where they clearly go back to Bhartrihari's initial formulation, right? We use, so words, all words actually, are the cause of this flash of insight on account of repetition, and then the context is the same. It's a very basic level, simple sort of awareness that is generated by words, like for animals or even so for children or even for animals. I wanted to point this out because in the commentary by Kamalashila, which is the bit in the middle here, which starts with Kamalashila, he paraphrases what repetition means in the verse of Shantarakshita, and he says that it's the repeated observation of a word being applied to some object. So you see a word being used again and again for certain kinds of objects. That is quite obviously a good idea to explain how you learn how to use a word. But more than that, in Dignāga, this is exactly how the technical notion of pervasion is explained in the case of speech verbal awareness. So we see words being used for tables, but not the word table for being used for chairs. And on this basis, we basically arrive at an understanding of the ontological relation, or an ontological relation, which allows us to perform an inference, which allows us to basically say that, well, somebody said table, so there is a table there. Just in the same way as once we've learned the connection between fire and smoke, we can infer fire from smoke. And once you've done this, so once you have repeated this observation often enough, you basically become someone who knows how a word works, how it refers to which object it refers to. And it's on account of this, and this happens early on because it's supposed to work for children and animals, some of whom are actually not linguistic in our usual opinions. And this is enough, so that constitutes the idea that a word can generate this insight into its object. Now, In Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, this is clearly presented as what the others think, i.e. the grammarians, followers of Bhartrihari. But if you read on a bit, a couple of verses to 905 there, then you'll see that there is an important concession. After considering all sorts of options for what the cause might be, apart from the Shabda, the conclusion is this: well, we can't really accept that this flash of insight is generated without a cause. That just doesn't make sense, because otherwise we would just have whatever cognition. There must be some sort of regularity. Otherwise we just have any cognition resulting from any word. And then if you say that the basis of this flash of insight is mutual difference, ittara ittara bheda, which is basically the same as Dignāga posited, and then Dhammakirti of the exclusion of other objects, then that is precisely our position. That is the Buddhist position. So Shantarakshita and Kamalashila again pick up on this notion, which I think is prominent in Dignāga. So I think it's safe to say that Dignāga posits or accepts that repetition is a condition for understanding sentences or any linguistic unit, including expressive words. Verbal awareness is an inference, and what I'd like to say is that he posits that repeated inferential production of an awareness, understanding a word, results over time in the perception of a word producing the according awareness directly. As I mentioned, there is another strand, in a sense, of perception and abhyasa in this tradition, which is very strong and prominent also, but there it's not directly related to inference, so that would be a topic for another talk. So to conclude, sorry for running so late, I think for Prajñākaragupta we could say that inference, together with habit formation, is really the foundation for our rational, at least everyday activities. Perception is necessary, so we can't do completely without perception. It proves that activity was successful. For example, we see fire in a particular place, and we can tie inference to a particular case, an object, once we have acted upon it. And I think that Prajñākaragupta's use of the notion of habit formation, specifically in this idea of inference and perception in this context, might have its basis, or at least a close relative, in Dignāga's theory of how words indicate objects, which is an inferential process, but one that I think nobody would analyze as an inferential process. So I don't think we are constantly inferring things for each individual speech sound that we hear. And I don't think Dignāga would have thought that either. So yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to say for today. Thank you very much for hanging on so long.
Grazie. Thank you very much. So, we collect your questions. What to start? Please.
Thank you, Patrick, for the lovely presentation. I think I've learned quite a bit about Dignāga and have a lot of further questions that I'm going to have to explore. Firstly, I was very interested by how he characterizes the role of perception and inference together in establishing also the necessity of the external object. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, how does he then move past the existence of the external object? Does he form a refutation which somehow ties into his, I imagine, temporary acceptance of externalism? Or is that move not... I'm just curious, how does he move past this point? Secondly, I was wondering, is this account of abhyasa and the way in which he characterizes this entire structure, is it unique amongst the authors of the logico-epistemological tradition, or is it something that he explicitly brings forth, but which we can also see sort of implicitly present in other authors?
Okay, let me see if I can answer that. So the first one is easy to answer. I don't really know.
Okay.
So the Prajñākaragupta peppers his work with comments that this is only like on the Vyavahara level, on this level of everyday activity. So if you want me to explain how we can interact with external objects, then I can give you this theory, but it's not supposed to stand up to extreme scrutiny. And it's already difficult in Dhammakirti to know exactly where the shift occurs, and I must admit I haven't read these sections in Prajñākaragupta yet, and there is I don't know if he needs to be motivated, if that was your question, to make this leap or to abolish external objects. So the one thing that I didn't mention in my talk is that Prajñākaragupta treats all of this as an illusion, so to speak. So the whole world is really not there in a strong sense. I think we act towards external objects and they never appear in our awareness in a significant sense. So basically especially in the context of enabling activity. So perception shows us if there is shows us something vividly, and then we might want to think that that's the object which we are perceiving. We don't have to. There are better theories in Prajñākaragupta's opinion. An inference certainly doesn't show us anything particular at all. It doesn't show us any vivid thing. It's spashta and aspashta in Sanskrit. Like any conceptual awareness. And so I think he's very careful to not go as far as Dhammakirti in the first place. So even in those verses where Dhammakirti seems to endorse external objects, he will be very careful not to engage too much. Of course, if you really want the answer to this question, you need to read Ivata's Sahupalamba Niyama book. The answer is in there, I guess, but hard to find. And for your second question, so I came to this by studying how Prajñākaragupta's argument for the duality of sources of knowledge works. So he wants to prove that there are two and only two, perception and inference. He doesn't want fewer, he doesn't want more than those two. And I think it's quite original as far as I can see. I don't know of any other commentators before or after him actually who are that explicit or even mention this really, that they are dependent on each other. So this verse is that without inference you can't have perception, without inference you can't, without perception you can't have inference. This dual dependency, mutual dependency, that's really quite specific to him. And he can, in arguing that, he has to appeal to the notion of habit formation, because that's the only way that he can save pratyaksha, perception, as a source of knowledge, something that lets you act in the conventional sense, so in the everyday sense. And that's why I went looking for precedents, let's say, of habit formation. And of course, there is a very strong tradition, or it's a general Yogacara idea. You find it in many texts. It's in Ashvagosha, it's the Mahayana Sangraha, Upanibandha, I think it's called. Anyway, it's not even limited to Buddhists, so you will also find, of course, Nyayikas and so on, appealing to this notion in certain contexts. Also Bhatrihari is not a Buddhist, but he's to some extent an idealist. So I think I'm always very cautious to say, this person invented this, because in Indian philosophy so many texts are missing. It's very hard to see who originated which idea. So we find this notion in Prajñākaragupta. I haven't really found it that clearly stated anywhere else. Of course, abhyasa is often invoked, especially in the realm of conceptual awareness, following upon perception. That's the standard, I would say, example, a standard case where you need it. And Prajñākaragupta really says that inference is how we act at first, due to thinking that things are different from us and perdure in time and so on. But then this generates habits, and with these habits then perception can instantaneously and without any conceptual intervention produce activity. That's how I read this. Yeah, thanks.
Can I ask a clarificatory question? So just to be clear, the mutual dependency between perception and inference does not impinge on them supporting activity in a mind-independent reality. You would have the mutual dependency also without a mind-independent sort of external reality being admitted by the...
No, so for Prajñākaragupta then, once you get rid of the external world, so once you prove, and I don't really know how he does that the external world doesn't exist, then there is only self-awareness basically left. And this is a form of perception, and this does not prompt activity anymore in the level of sources of knowledge. So it is a source of knowledge, but in a different sense than on the in the everyday level. So yeah. So
there's a clear sort of almost vyavaharika.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Distinction between these two levels.
Exactly. Yeah. That's.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Tired? Yeah. No other questions? Well, you spoke about Prajñākaragupta's tentative to recollect some ideas of Dignāga to put it into his commentaries. As it's an old Indian tradition to use commentaries even to pose own ideas, not only to recollect old ideas. Which importance has this element in Prajñākaragupta to use the commentaries to transmit own ideas, not only those of Dignāga?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So you basically. So you often read that commentaries are sort of one of the tools for production of new knowledge, and they basically have to pay at least lip service to the text they're commenting on, even if they introduce new ideas. And for a long time I thought that that's actually what Prajñākaragupta is doing. But then I got a bit hesitant to say that for some other reasons actually. But anyway, and then I started to dig around for preliminaries of this. And then, in addition, in Vienna, one of the main projects I'm working on is an edition of Jinendra Buddhist commentary on Dignāga. So I was lucky enough to get big exposure to his Apoha theory, Dignāga's Apoha theory. And I was very enthusiastic to see how good it is. I mean, and theoretically, it's really well advanced, amazingly mature as a philosophical system. So, Dhammakirti is a lot more detailed, but and these are the other traces that I didn't mention. So, and this is really hypothetical, but Dignāga, for example, he doesn't really have this strong notion of artha kriya, so causal efficacy, and link to that the particular thing. It's not that he says anything against it, but it just doesn't do much in his theory. And Prajñākaragupta, I think, lacks this at least, and tries to accommodate that a bit more. And what's also interesting is that Prajñākaragupta doesn't write much about the Apoha theory, so about Dignāga's language theory, let's say. And I think one reason is that it's enough if he talks about inference. So, because for Dignāga, language is, or words work like reasons, and so if you solve the inference problem, you've actually solved the language problem, so the reference problem at least. One other thing that's there is that something I've explored in other talks is that Prajñākaragupta all but negates the relation of cause and effect, which is sort of fundamental to Dhammakirti's ontological project. And it's also something that Dignāga doesn't need. He doesn't distinguish logical reasons according to these types. He has few arguments, I think, which are based on cause and effect. And so there are echoes, I would at least say. So we don't know the intention of this commentator and of many others. It's just not available anymore, accessible anymore. But we would, I think one shouldn't blindly, any time that one reads something new in a commentary, think that this is an innovation or something like that. I think we should be a bit careful at least.
Okay.
So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? So I thank you for both your talks. And tomorrow we continue at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we are very happy to have tomorrow Birgit Kellner and Francesco Sfera. So see you tomorrow.
Thank you.